Moving into Chapter 5, how we do the skeletal system, we're going to continue our systemic approach as we move through the body. So looking at the framework, the skeletal system, we're going to focus on the body's bones and ligaments and tendons and cartilages that hold these things together. As we move from there into the musculature, we'll see the relationship between those two systems. So functionally, it provides some support. So clearly it's going to give us the ability to hold up our own weight between the bones of the legs and the pelvis, as well as the vertebrae. That's going to help us maintain and upright posture. Bones are going to provide some protections. When we look at the bones of the skull, help protect the brain. The bones in the ribs and the sternum help protect the lungs and the heart. And continue with the functions, one of the most notable or most well known is movement. Now, in conjunction with skeletal muscles, we're able to use the bones and the joints to carry out certain movements for the body. Metabolically, it serves as a reservoir for minerals as well as adipose tissue. So almost all of the body's calcium is stored in bone. And as we'll see a little later on, it's freed up when we need it and it's stored when we have an excess. About 85% of the body's phosphorus is also stored in bone. And those are stored in the form of calcium phosphate salts. And in certain bones, we find adipose tissue in the marrow. And we're going to talk a bit more about the difference between our red marrows and our yellow marrows. It's also responsible for hematopoiesis. You may see this referred to as hemopoiesis as well, which is called blood cell formation. All blood cells are made in the marrow of certain bones. So we have approximately 206 bones in the body. And we say approximately because we have extra bones. We have certain bones that will appear in sutures of the skull. And occasionally we find some additional small bones. So 206 is our optimal number. And we break those into two divisions, the axial and the appendicular. So the axial is shown in blue on the diagram here, which is the bones of the skull, the vertebral column, and the ribs. And then the appendicular is everything else. So this is going to be our upper and lower limbs as well as our shoulder girdles and our hip girdles. We're going to classify bones by a number of different ways. The first is by shape. So we start off with long bones, and by definition a long bone is longer than wide. And this is all the bones of the limbs except for the kneecap or the patella, and the bones of the wrist and ankle, which are the carpals and the tarsals. Long bones have a shaft portion and two expanded ends. And the bones of the fingers, not the bones of the wrist, are long bones because they have expanded ends and they are longer than they are wide. Our short bones are roughly cube-shaped. These are the bones of the wrist and ankle. So again, the carpals and tarsals. We have flat bones, which are thin and flat, and usually have a little bit of curve to them. And these are the bones of the scapulae, the sternum, the ribs, and most bones of the skull. And then everything else that doesn't really fit, we call irregular, because they have strange shapes. They have non-definable shapes that don't fit those three previous classifications. And these are going to be the hip bones, two of our skull bones that are kind of deep, the sphenoid and ethmoid bones, as we'll find, and then the vertebrae. The bones are organs. They are living tissue. Even though they're a hard tissue, they are a connective tissue. They're composed of fibrous connective tissue, cartilage, blood supply, lymphatic support, adipose tissue, and nerve tissue. And as we'll look a little bit deeper into this in future slides, you can see we have a communication pathway between the blood supply outside the bone that works its way through a number of canal systems and actually gets deep into the bone. And that's important for a number of reasons that we'll talk about. So we have this outer compact bone and an inner spongy bone. And so our compact bone provides a lot of strength in one direction. and then our spongy bone gives us strength in numerous directions. So there's our compact bone, and then if we look at this close-up here, a spongy bone, then what we're going to see is a lot of things called trabeculae. We're going to use the word trabeculae to describe a number of structures within the human body that have this form. So irregular form, lots of kind of needle-like projections or irregular projections. Bone is very dynamic, and we're going to learn more about that metabolically. When we have a calcium excess in the body, we build new bone. When we have a calcium deficit in the body, we tear down bone in order to free the calcium up. This is a good cross-section showing you compact bone, and this is a long bone. It's kind of this shaft portion and this expanded end. And so in this case, we're seeing the very dense compact bone that gives us a lot of structural integrity in this plane. And then here we see the spongy bone. And you can see lots and lots of trabeculae there. So there's another little line right here that we'll talk about a little bit later on. Right. It is a connective tissue, so by definition, we're going to find a few cells and a lot of extracellular matrix. So the cells that we're going to talk about are called osteoblasts. That's one type. And these are cells that build bone. Any cell that ends in BLAST is going to be something that constructs something else. So an osteoblast is going to build bone cells. A fibroblast is going to build fibers. A chondroblast is going to build cartilage. So they're going to synthesize and secrete the collagen fiber network and then the other components, meaning the calcium phosphate salts, into the bone tissue. They initiate this process of calcification, and you find this both in the periosteum and the endosteum. The endosteum is this inner portion, and the periosteum is this outer portion. We start looking at bones. The other type of cell, or another type of cell, are osteocytes. And these are mature bone cells. So here we have these osteocytes, and they're arranged in canals. The secretion of the matrix, the collagenous fiber matrix, traps the osteoblast, and they no longer secrete matrix. So they start maintaining bone tissue. And those are going to be our osteocytes. Our osteoclasts are going to be responsible for breaking bone down. So the way that we make an osteoclast is we fuse a lot of monocytes, and the monocyte is a type of leukocyte. And then what it does is it goes through the process of bone resorption. So there's our osteoclast in this little animation. And we can see our starting point here. We see all these multiple nuclei from the fusion of these monocytes. Here's our unchanged bone. As they start working, you're going to start breaking down and dissolving that calcium phosphate matrix in order to free up calcium. We have something called a ruffled border on this portion of the plasma membrane that's actually in contact with the bone. And what it does is it pumps out these digestive enzymes and helps to break it down. And you have an animation, an artist rendition. I'm also going to show you a YouTube animation that explains it. So here's our cell type. There's our osteocyte. There's our osteoblast, which is going to be building bone. There's our osteoclast, which is going to, with this ruffled border, is going to be breaking bone down.
Osteoclasts and their precursor cells are regulated by different signaling pathways and molecules. One key regulatory molecule is the protein rank ligand, which is produced by a variety of cell types, including osteoblasts and their precursor cells. This protein has been shown to exert its effects on osteoclasts and their precursors through an interaction with the cell surface receptor, rank. The interaction between rank ligand and its receptor, rank, triggers the activation of signaling pathways, which are involved in the differentiation, activation, and survival of osteoclasts. Such signaling pathways can trigger the fusion of precursor cells to form mature multinucleated osteoclasts. On these mature cells, rank ligand can interact with its receptor, promoting osteoclast activity and survival, leading to increased resorption of bone. To balance the effect of rank ligand, osteoprotegerin, or OPG, is secreted from osteoblasts. This protein acts like a decoy in binding to rank ligand, preventing rank ligand from interacting with and activating its receptor on the surface of osteoclasts. Various hormones and cytokines modulate the balance between rank ligand and OPG. For example, parathyroid hormone stimulates the production of rank ligand while at the same time repressing the expression of OPG, an effect thought to increase the activity of osteoclasts. Conversely, estrogen can increase the expression of OPG and inhibits rank ligand signaling. These changes, which are thought to reduce the activity of osteoclasts, may contribute to estrogen's ability to preserve or increase skeletal mass.
The bone matrix consists of both organic and inorganic components, and it's mostly inorganic. So looking first at our organic materials, what we have are collagen fibers and other organic materials, but the collagen mostly provides the bone with some flexibility and resilience and the ability to resist stretching and twisting. The inorganic component, which is mostly our calcium phosphate salts, as I mentioned before, as well as some calcium hydroxide. And so these are actually what make the rigid structures or make bone hard. And so when we start off with the collagen before it's impregnated with these salts, it does have some pliability, some flexibility, but then these minerals give it a hardness and a resistance to compression and to crushing. Looking at our long bone structure, which we're going to focus mostly on, I mentioned previously that there's a shaft portion and expanded ends. The shaft portion of the long bone is referred to as the diaphysis, and the expanded ends are referred to as the epiphyses. So we'll use the word diaphysis or diaphyseal, and epiphysis or epiphyseal. And I mentioned one of these lines in the previous slide that we saw of a cross-section of a bone, and these are going to be representative of the epiphyseal discs or epiphyseal plates that we'll talk more about. So again, compact bone along the shaft and spongy bone on the expanded ends. All right, so what it does is gives us some strength in all planes here and some linear strength here. And then we're going to find on these long bones a hyaline cartilage cover, also referred to as articular cartilage. And what that does is it cushions the bone and reduces friction between bones in joints. The external surface of the bone, except for the joint surface, is called the periosteum. And so what we have is this double layer wall, and it's a fibrous coating of the bone. And again, it's on all parts of the bone except for the articular surfaces. Periosteum is connected to bone by some strong collagen fibers, and these are called Sharpey's fibers. I mentioned previously, again, we have the periosteum on the outside and the endosteum on the inner lining. And so what this does is it covers the trabeculae of the spongy bone, as well as it lines the medullary cavity and the canals that pass through the bone. And this is where we find both osteoclasts and osteoblasts. Looking at the structure of short bones, irregular bones, and flat bones, they've got a thin outer periosteum and an endosteum in the middle, and then most of what's in between is spongy bone. They're not cylindrical, there's no diaphysis, there are no epiphyses. There is marrow between the trabeculae rather than in a marrow cavity like we saw in the long bone. So going back to the long bone for just a moment. This is our medullary cavity. That's where we find our bone marrow. And then we get into our irregular bones. These are going to be your marrow spaces between the trabeculae and spongy bone. Bone marrow is just kind of a general term for the soft tissue that we find in the medullary cavity of a long bone and in the spaces of the trabeculae spongy bone. We have red marrow and we have yellow marrow. Red bone marrow is that marrow that's responsible for hematopoiesis. Refer to that as hematopoietic tissue. And it looks kind of like a gelatinous blood, very delicate mesh of reticular fibers that are saturated with these immature blood cells and some adipocytes. And so our red marrows are very active blood cell producing marrow. Our yellow marrow is actually where we're going to store some additional adipose. Right, every child that's born, we have all of the medullary cavities filled with red bone marrow. And in addition, we'll look from a developmental standpoint that the bones of newborns are very flexible because they're not calcified. They're not completely calcified. There's a lot of collagen fibers. But as we transition from life stages, early to later, so we go from childhood into adolescence and then into adulthood, the shafts start to become filled with fatty yellow bone marrow. Right? The yellow marrow does not produce blood, but in the event that we need it to, we can actually transform it back into red marrow. So if we go from an active lifestyle to a very sedentary one, to where we transition to a lot of yellow bone marrow, then we transition back to a very, very demanding active lifestyle, we can convert some of those yellow bone marrows back into red. In adults, the red marrow is limited to the axial skeleton, the pectoral and pelvic girdles, and then the proximal heads of the humerus and the femur. So proximal, going back to directional terms, proximal means closest to, and the bones, it's listed, the humerus is the bone of the upper arm, the femur is the bone of the upper leg. Looking at the microscopic structure of compact bone, we've already mentioned the osteocytes, osteoclast, osteoblast, and we're going to find these osteocytes within these canals, within these concentric circles that are going to be filled in between with matrix. So this is a cross section. When we break it into kind of its own structures, we have a central canal, and that contains both an artery and a vein, as well as innervation. And then these areas we're going to refer to as lamellae between the collagen fibers. And what this gives us, if you look at the orientation of the collagen fibers, is it gives us a lot of resistance to twisting forces. Right? The Haversian canals are these little tubes that run through and help us connect. So I'm moving to a little different view. Right? So there's our concentric lamellae. Within there, we're going to find our osteocytes. And we can see some of these osteocytes. And then we see these canals, these central canals. And then we see these connecting canals. So I'm looking at those. That's how we're able to communicate with the blood vessels in the marrow, in the middle of the bone, in the medullary cavity, with the outside of the periosteum. So we have, just to keep up with the nomenclature, we have our Haversian canals, and we have our Volkmann's canals. Right? Within the little lamellae, what we're going to find are the osteocytes. The osteocytes are contained within these little bony vaults called lacunae, and then those lacunae communicate with the central canal and with each other through these little structures called canaliculi. And our canaliculi are going to be, if that's a term we use in some other tissues. So that allows the osteocytes to get the nutrients they need, eliminate the waste that they need, and then be signaled or signal to one another in order to carry out the functions necessary. So when we look at spongy bone, right, so there's our trabeculae. We can find some adipocytes or fat cells in there. We have this bone matrix, and we have some osteocytes. Right, very irregular. We don't have the lamellae and the osteocytes and the Haversian and Volkmann's canal arrangement. because of the change in structure of the bone. So the ossification process, or osteogenesis, is how we form bones. We've got a couple of ways to do it. So in embryos, we start with precursor tissues that eventually form bony tissue. In children and adolescents, the ossification centers start to form the bone. In adults, the bones quit growing in length, with a few exceptions. And then most of the work that's going to be done is in bone remodeling and bone repair. If we fracture a bone, we've got to fix it. If we need to change the density of a bone because of the way we're using it, we can do that. So embryonically, we start off with a hyaline cartilage skeleton. And during development, most of that cartilage is replaced by bone. There are a few places where cartilage remains. So if we look at the bridge of the nose, we look at some of the connection parts of the ribs, as well as in the joints. We're going to wind up with some remnants of cartilage. We'll talk more about those later. The epiphyseal plates that I showed you in the long bone allow for growth of long bone during childhood and adolescence and early adulthood. And what happens is that we have a row of reproducing cells that are continually producing new cartilage cells. As those cartilage cells are reproduced, they're pushed away from the epiphyseal plate. And what happens is we ossify. So we start to break down the cartilage, we start to infuse that tissue with bone and bony matrix, so eventually it becomes bone. Once those growth plates or epiphyseal plates have completely ossified, then long bone growth is no longer possible. They continue to be remodeled and lengthened until growth stops. They are going to grow in width by something called appositional growth. And what we'll see is an increased diameter of the marrow cavity and additional compact bone on the peripheral surface, so out towards the periosteum. And I've got a couple of examples of when that would happen. So embryonically, there's our hyaline cartilage pad, and then we start to form this bony tissue. We start to invade with blood vessels. There's our hyaline cartilage that's going to be at the end. There's our epiphyseal plate. There's our opposing epiphyseal plate. And so our bone is going to grow in both length as well as in width. So again, this is starting with embryonic development, moving up into adolescence. And I've got a video here that will help explain most of this.
Let's learn about endochondral. In endochondral ossification, bones cartilage models. There are a few steps to this process. The cartilage at the center of the bone begins to ossify. The outer portion of the cartilage, called the perichondrium, begins to form the periosteum. Blood vessels enter the bone and help to form a primary ossification center. The cartilage cells, or chondrocytes, become bone-forming osteoblasts around the periphery of bone. These osteoblasts form a collar of bone at the margins. As the primary ossification center matures, chondrocytes die and leave a hollow area which will become the medullary or marrow cavity. Blood vessels also enter at the ends of the bone, called the epiphysis, and help to form secondary ossification centers. The medullary cavity continues to hollow while cartilage continues to form bone at the epiphyseal plate. Ossification results in the formation of spongy bone at the epiphysis and compact or cortical bone at the shaft or diaphysis. The epiphyseal plates will eventually fuse and bone growth will stop. A layer of hyaline cartilage remains at the ends of the bone. We hope you have learned something about endochondral ossification, and see you next time.
Just to follow up a little bit on that, we're looking at bone growth, which is what was just shown. We have cartilage growing here. We have cartilage being replaced by bone in this region. And we have cartilage growing here, and then cartilage being replaced by bone here. So we're going to grow in both directions here. We're going to form these cartilaginous structures that then become bone. When we start remodeling, we can actually change the shape of bone. So in this case, what has happened is we've seen that the shape of the bone changes. We want to resort bone from this area, and then we're going to make this thicker. We want to resort bone here. So I'm going to take bone from here and push it this direction, or replace it out here. Again, a couple of examples of that. So there's our growth plate. There's our epiphyseal plate, as well as here. So when we hit puberty, all of our hormones that are aging start to really accelerate this process. So our osteoblasts begin to produce bone faster, and what happens is the epiphyseal plate gets narrower and narrower, and eventually it's going to disappear. Now there's going to be a line that remains, as you can see on this x-ray, but it is bone. The reason we see it as a line is because the density between those is different, which is what x-rays are going to capture. As far as growth and thickness goes, osteoblasts that are beneath that periosteum layer secrete a bone matrix on the external surface, which makes the bones get thicker. As I mentioned in the previous 2 slides ago, the osteoclasts on the endosteum break it down and make the cavity wider. What you wind up with is an increase in shaft diameter, even though the actual amount of bone in the diaphysis, that that compact bone, remains relatively unchanged. Sometimes bones can break, and that depends on the amount of stress we put on it, or if we get stress from unusual directions, or in some cases if we have some type of a malformation. So there we can see a fracture of the tibia. And how well it's going to heal depends on a lot of factors. So does it have blood supply? Does it have the nutrients that it needs? Can the periosteum and endosteum survive the injury? The way that a bone repairs itself is we're going to invade this. Here's our break here. So we're going to invade this with blood and make a large blood clot. And as a result, the bones that are right there at that site are going to be sacrificed. They're going to die. And we see inflammation, and we see pain, and we see obviously a lot of swelling beneath the periosteum, and we see the periosteum bulging here. Once that starts the repair process, what's going to happen is we're going to move capillaries in there, we're going to move macrophages in there to start cleaning up the debris. We're going to invade this with some fibroblasts to produce collagen fibers, and then we're going to take some of our chondroblasts and start secreting that cartilage. Once we've got that cartilaginous network laid down, we're going to come in and we're going to start forming spongy bone in this location. So what it does is it spans the break, and it kind of forms a splint. If you've broken a bone, you've probably noticed that we wind up with a little bit of kind of a healing residual right there, so I have a bump there, especially noticeable on fingers as well as on like a collarbone, if you ever have a fracture of your collarbone. So again, we can continue to increase the number of chondrocytes in here. We get our trabeculae increasing, and eventually we're going to get our healed fracture. It's not going to be the same as it was before. In a lot of cases, this break is going to be stronger than the surrounding bone, just because we've taken compact bone, which has very good linear support, but not so much laterally, and we've replaced it with a fair amount of compact bone, which changes it. Eventually, it's going to kind of return to its original shape, but there'll be some evidence of this going there. Our fracture types, we are classifying fractures based on the position of the bone ends after the break. So a comminuted fracture is one where we have fragments, and we get 3 or more pieces, bone fragments. And in this case, we're going to have to repair it. We may have to remove some of those when we have to go in and place some screws or plates or supporting structures to get those to line up. This does happen more in the elderly because their bones are more brittle because they've lost some calcium. We have a green stick fracture where the bone doesn't break completely. One side is bent, one is broken, and that is a common fracture in children because they're mostly collagen and less calcium phosphate salts. A spiral injury is one where you get a ragged break that's caused by excessive twisting. These are common in some sports injuries, and unfortunately it is an injury of abuse, where you've got someone that's grabbing an arm or a leg and twisting it. Compression fractures, where the bone is actually crushed, and what we wind up with, we can have a depressed fracture where one bone fragment is driven into another spongy bone or medullary space. So we have depressed fractures and skull fractures quite often. All right, there's a simple closed fracture. The ends are apart, obviously, but they've not been displaced. Here's a green stick fracture where you can see that this part is broken and this one is not. It's called a green stick. If you try to break a green stick, a living piece of wood, it's not going to break cleanly like it would with a dry one. And then there's our open fracture, and we'll also refer to some of these as compound fractures when we have bone penetrating up through the skin, which, as you can imagine, we have bone damage here and some immediate tissue damage. On this one we have bone damage and we've got quite a bit of tissue damage laterally. I mentioned bone remodeling, so here's our bone, here's our compressive force. And so if our force is here, can you see based on the size of the arrows, if the force is more on this side of the bone, we're going to wind up kind of removing bone from here and adding new bone on this side. And what that does is equalize those compressive forces. So lifestyle, location have a lot to do with this. An example given here has to do with, you've got someone that's a power lifter, has been really placing a lot of demands on the bones in this plane. And so we're going to remove some of our bone and remodel it. And we're going through a really thickened by oppositional growth. The same thing we're doing right here because of these compressive forces, trying to equalize them. Right. Question here is, the astronauts tend to experience bone atrophy when they're in space for an extended period of time. And just to give you a little hint on that, see what the effects of gravity are on the body. We do have some nutritional demands that the bones place on us. And we have to have sufficient dietary intake of calcium and phosphate salts. Now, it doesn't matter how much calcium phosphate we ingest if we are lacking in calcitrol, and that is dependent upon vitamin D because it has to do with cholecalciferol. So what that means is that that's the relationship between exposure to sunlight and strong bones. Exposure to sunlight and the proper synthesis of vitamin D. So adequate diet, adequate hormonal balance, adequate exposure to UV radiation, all those things are helpful in making strong bones. We also need vitamin C, A, K, as well as B12 for bone growth. We do have some hormonal effects. So growth hormone, which is produced by the pituitary gland, and thyroxine, which is produced from the thyroid gland, stimulate bone growth. So growth hormone stimulates protein synthesis and cell growth throughout the body, including bone cells. Thyroxine stimulates cell metabolism and increases the rate of osteoblast activity. So if they're balanced, then that's good. If they're not balanced, then we have some problems. Now, we'll look at a couple of examples of problems in just a moment. All right, estrogens in females and androgens in males cause those osteoblasts to produce bone faster than the epiphyseal cartilage can divide. This is what gives us those growth spurts, and then eventually the closure of the epiphyseal plate. Right. Estrogens cause faster closure of the epiphyseal growth plate than do androgens, which is why females typically reach their full adult height earlier than males. Depending upon what data sets you look at, the females typically reach their full adult height before age 20 or 21, and males it's a little bit closer to 23 to 25. These are general terms. Obviously, there are lots of exceptions to that. Personally, I've been the height I am since I was 15 years old. So that has to do with when my epiphyseal place closed. Right. Other hormones that affect bone growth include insulin, as well as some glucocorticoids. And so bone formation is stimulated by the release of insulin. Glucocorticoids inhibit activity of osteoclasts. Parathyroid hormone and calcitonin are going to work against each other in order to maintain calcium at the right homeostatic level. And since the skeleton is where we store most of our calcium, the impact of these hormones is what affects how we deposit them and how we resorb them. I've got another. So looking further into the relationship between calcitonin from the thyroid and parathyroid hormone. So calcitonin acts to reduce blood calcium levels. And so that causes a decrease in osteoclast activity, which results in a decreased breakdown of bone and a decreased release of calcium. It also stimulates osteoblasts to make more bone, which means more calcium will be taken from the blood. So when we have elevated blood calcium levels, we take our calcium supplements and eat a calcium-rich meal, then our serum calcium is going to be too high. The thyroid is going to release calcitonin in order to lower that, to get it again back down to our homeostatic balance levels. So there's our increased blood calcium levels. Calcitonin is released from the thyroid, it causes a decrease in osteoclasts, an increase in osteoblast activity. The result is we drop the calcium levels. The parathyroid releases parathyroid hormone, which is the opposite. So in response to low blood calcium, it causes a release of calcium from the bones, as well as we'll learn later, it's going to cause some changes within the digestive and urinary systems. So we're going to wind up increasing our blood calcium because our serum calcium is too low based on our homeostatic levels. All right, so putting this in a different form, there's a drop in serum calcium. We release parathyroid hormone, right, causes decreased osteoblast activity, also causes an increase in calcitriol synthesis and a decrease in calcium excretion. Again, I mentioned digestive and urinary systems. Right? If we increase intestinal calcium absorption, we decrease how much we're getting rid of. If we decrease the amount of bone that's being built, all of those are going to increase blood calcium levels. So that relationship between the thyroid and parathyroid hormone and calcitonin is going to be an all day, every day kind of regulatory action. Some of the clinical conditions we deal with bone, we have osteomalacia, and normally what that means is we've got some type of dietary cause or some type of other cause that results in very slender, poorly mineralized bones. So we don't have enough of our mineral matrix in there. Right. Rickets is a form of osteomalacia that we see in children, and because they're still growing, because we're having this bone activity, and they don't have sufficient minerals, what you wind up with is this characteristic bowing of the legs and deformities of the pelvis, ribs, and the skull in extreme situations. Another clinical condition is osteomyelitis, and what that means is inflammation of the bone marrow, as you can see it broken down here. It can be caused by bacteria, or it's called the bacteria that can enter the body through some type of wound. So if we have a compound fracture, we have a nearby infection, or the infection spreads into the medullary cavity, then we can wind up with this osteomyelitis. Before we developed antibiotics, this was a fatal situation because we couldn't get into the bone marrow adequately to deal with the infection. Osteoporosis is a condition that's more popular and more well understood, and we normally associate it with the elderly, and we normally associate it with postmenopausal women because of the role of estrogen in osteoblast activity. So there's our normal bone. And when we see a decrease in calcium intake, we see a decrease in the secretion of estrogens, then what happens is we start to see these very porous bones. So this is our normal bone, and this is literally holy bone or osteoporotic bone. And so we start to see kind of a compression in the vertebrae. We start to see this humpback or hunched appearance because of all the body mass that's up here, and the bones that are trying to support it can't quite support it. So we do see some compression or crushing. We start to see that decline. This is one of the reasons that we tend to shrink as we get older, is we're not quite as upright, and our bony structures are not quite as structurally sound. Most of our overgrowth or undergrowth issues are hormonal. And so giantism, and giantism is a relative thing. As a population, we're getting taller. But this is the world's tallest man on record, who's 8 feet 11 inches tall and change, and is no longer with us. He died relatively young, which is not uncommon. There are a number of people that are over 8 feet, and there are some that are living still, but none of them have reached this height. There's a fossil record of an individual that was taller, but less is known about that. So that's if we have hypersecretion of growth hormone. So we wind up growing the bones too long, too fast, before they become ossified. Eventually they become ossified and they'll stop growing because the pituitary secretes growth hormone. But once the ossification occurs, then they can no longer grow in height. If the hypersecretion of growth hormone continues into adulthood, then in addition to this giantism, the individual can express acromegaly. And so what happens is, since the bones can't get longer, they just get thicker. So we go back to our appositional growth, and so we start to really notice it. We get kind of a large forehead and large jaw. We definitely see it in the hands, the bones of the hands, as well as in the jaw. With a deficiency of growth hormone, we can have pituitary dwarfism, and achondroplasic is different, but where we don't have sufficient growth hormone, what happens is we have very short, long bones, and typically we see a maximum height of about 4 feet. We can treat this by supplementing with growth hormone during the growth years, as long as it's prior to the ossification of the epiphyseal plates. Some other bone issues, when we start looking at the curvature, the proper and improper curvature of the spine. When we see a deviation to one side or the other, that's referred to as scoliosis. When we see this unusual curvature in the region of the thorax, that is kyphosis. And then when we see this unusual forward pressing of the lumbar curvature, that's lordosis. The next 2 slides, which are the end of this lecture, give you indications of bone markings. So some of the terms that we're going to use to describe things: tuberosities versus trochanters, condyles versus epicondyles. So I'm going to spend a little time working on these to make sure you're understanding what those processes are, because the processes are important, and the bone markings are important because they're going to represent either some place where we have an articulation or a joint, some place where we're going to attach a tendon or a ligament in order to attach muscles, or where we've got blood vessels or other structures going through. So some of them are unique to certain ribs, certain bones, and some of them are pretty widespread. For example, we're going to describe a number of structures that are referred to as a meatus. So the opening, we're seeing this from the anterior side. This is the opening from the external ear. So that's going to be our auditory or acoustic meatus. So we have a canal-like passageway that goes from the outside of the skull into the inner part of the skull.